humidity in New Orleans clings to the skin like a damp shroud, even long after the sun has set. Down in the French Quarter, the gas lamps flicker against the stone facades, casting long dancing shadows that seem to have a life of their own. Tourists walk these streets laughing and drinking, oblivious to the layers of blood and sorrow beneath their feet. But there is one building on Royal Street that silences even the most boisterous crowds when they learn its history. The LaLaurie Mansion stands 3 stories tall and imposes a gray and ominous presence over the sidewalk. Its iron balconies feature intricate lacework that looks beautiful from a distance, but feels like a cage when viewed from up close. This mansion at 1140 Royal Street is not merely a house made of brick and mortar, but a vessel for a darkness that has festered for nearly 2 centuries. Locals who walk their dogs late at night will often cross the street to avoid walking directly in front of its heavy doors. They say you can feel eyes watching you from behind the shuttered windows on the upper floors. It is a sensation of being hunted by something that cannot be seen, but is intensely felt. The air around the property feels colder than the rest of the humid city, as if the house itself draws the warmth out of the living. This is the legacy of Madame Delphine LaLaurie. To understand the true horror of this place, we must travel back to the early 19th century, when New Orleans was the glittering jewel of the South. It was a time of immense wealth and crushing poverty, existing side by side in a delicate and dangerous balance. The social season was filled with grand balls and opera performances where the elite came to see and be seen. In this world of high society, reputation was the only currency that truly mattered. A person could get away with almost anything as long as they maintained the proper appearance in public. Madame LaLaurie was a master of this social game, and she played it with a cold and calculating precision. Delphine was born into a powerful and established Creole family, which gave her an elevated status from the moment she took her first breath. She was beautiful and charming, and possessed a sharp wit that captivated the men and intimidated the women of her circle. She married 3 times, and each marriage seemed to elevate her social standing and increase her substantial wealth. By the time she married Dr. Louis LaLaurie, she was one of the most prominent women in the city. They purchased the property on Royal Street and built a mansion that was designed to be the envy of all their neighbors. It was a palace fit for a queen of New Orleans society. The interior of the LaLaurie Mansion was a testament to extravagant taste and unlimited funds. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceilings, catching the light of hundreds of beeswax candles during their lavish dinner parties. The floors were covered in imported rugs, and the walls were adorned with fine art from Europe. Guests who were lucky enough to receive an invitation would marvel at the hospitality of their hostess. Delphine moved through the crowded rooms with grace and a smile that never seemed to waver. She pampered her guests with the finest wines and the most delicious Creole cuisine available in the city. But the house had a split personality. While the lower floors were filled with music and laughter, a very different reality existed in the shadows of the upper levels and the detached slave quarters. Servants moved silently through the halls, keeping their heads down and their eyes averted. It was not uncommon for the enslaved people of that era to be fearful of their masters. But the terror in the LaLaurie household was palpable. Guests began to notice that the house slaves appeared gaunt and incredibly nervous. Their hands shook when they poured wine, and they flinched at the slightest sudden movement. At first, people dismissed it as the behavior of poorly trained staff. But soon, the whispers began to circulate. Rumors in the French Quarter travel faster than the wind coming off the Mississippi River. Neighbors began to talk about the strange sounds they heard coming from the LaLaurie residence late at night. They spoke of muffled cries and the distinct sound of a whip cracking in the darkness. Some claimed to have seen servants being dragged to the upper rooms, never to be seen again. But Delphine LaLaurie was a powerful woman with powerful friends, and for a long time, the law turned a blind eye. She continued to host her parties and wear her expensive gowns, while the rot inside her home grew deeper and darker with each passing day. The facade began to crack in a very public and horrifying way during the early 1830s. A young enslaved girl named Lee was brushing the hair of Madame LaLaurie in one of the upstairs bedrooms. The child hit a snag in the hair and caused Delphine some minor pain. The reaction from the mistress of the house was instant and terrifying rage. She grabbed a whip and began to chase the terrified girl through the room. The child fled out onto the balcony, desperate to escape the wrath of the woman who owned her. With nowhere left to run, and the whip cracking behind her, the girl climbed over the railing. The neighbors watched in horror as the small child lost her grip and fell from the balcony to the stone courtyard below. The impact was fatal, and the incident could not be swept under the rug. An investigation was launched, and the authorities were forced to take action against the prominent socialite. Delphine and her husband were found guilty of cruelty and forced to pay a fine. The law also decreed that their enslaved workers be confiscated and sold at public auction to get them away from the abusive household. It seemed for a moment that justice had been served, and the nightmare at 1140 Royal Street was finally over. However, the cunning of Madame LaLaurie knew no bounds. She arranged for her relatives to purchase the enslaved people at the auction and then secretly return them to the mansion under the cover of night. The very people who thought they had been saved were dragged back into the belly of the beast. This act of deception sealed their fate and emboldened Delphine. She realized she was untouchable, and her sadism grew unchecked. The mansion became a fortress of secrets where the walls were thick enough to muffle the screams. The atmosphere in the house shifted from oppressive to downright demonic as the abuse escalated into torture. Life on Royal Street continued on the surface as if nothing had happened. The doctor and his wife were seen walking arm in arm and attending Mass on Sundays. But those who looked closely saw a change in Delphine. Her eyes held a manic gleam, and her obsession with control became absolute. The shutters of the mansion remained closed even on the sunniest days, creating a perpetual twilight inside the home. The neighbors stopped asking questions out of fear of retribution, but they avoided walking on the side of the street where the mansion stood. A heavy gloom settled over the block, as if the very stones were absorbing the pain. The breaking point arrived on the morning of April 10th, in the year 1834. A fire broke out in the kitchen of the residence, and smoke began to billow into the street. Firefighters and concerned citizens rushed to the scene to help extinguish the flames. When they entered the kitchen, they found a 70-year-old woman chained by her ankle to the stove. She was the cook, and she had set the fire herself. When they asked her why she would do such a thing, she told them that she preferred death by fire to being taken up to the attic. She said anyone who was taken there never came back. This chilling confession stopped the men in their tracks. The fire was quickly brought under control, but the words of the cook hung in the air like poison. A crowd had gathered outside, sensing that the secrets of the house were about to be laid bare. The bystanders demanded that the firefighters and the judge, who had arrived on the scene, inspect the attic. Dr. LaLaurie tried to block their path, playing the part of the offended gentleman. He told them to mind their own business and not to worry about the private areas of his home. But the mob was growing restless and angry, ignoring the protests of the homeowners. The men broke down the heavy door that led to the slave quarters in the attic. A wave of heat and a stench of decay hit them with such force that some of the men gagged and had to step back. The air was thick with the smell of old blood and infection. They lit lanterns to pierce the gloom and stepped into a scene that would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their lives. The attic was not just a storage space or a sleeping quarter. It was a chamber of horrors designed by a mind that had lost all connection to humanity. 7 enslaved people were found in the attic, suspended in various contorted positions. They were suspended by iron collars around their necks, and their limbs were stretched and torn. They had been there for months, judging by their emaciated frames and the severity of their wounds. The level of cruelty was beyond anything the seasoned firefighters had ever witnessed. It was not merely punishment. It was a systematic attempt to reshape the human form through pain. The victims were alive, but they were barely recognizable as human beings. The silence of the room was broken only by their ragged breathing. One man had a hole in his head with a stick used to stir his brains. while another woman had her bones broken and reset in odd angles to make her look like a crab. Their mouths were stuffed with rags to stifle their screams, or sewn shut entirely. The floor was sticky with filth, and the walls were stained dark. The sheer malice required to inflict such suffering was incomprehensible. These were not acts of passion or sudden rage, but calculated experiments in agony carried out over a long period of time. The men who found them wept openly at the sight, unable to process the evil before them. News of the discovery spread to the street below instantly. The crowd, which had been curious, transformed into a vengeful mob. The people of New Orleans were accustomed to the brutality of slavery. But this was something else entirely. This was the work of a monster. Calls for justice rang out, and men began to search for ropes. They wanted to drag Madame LaLaurie and her husband out of the house and hang them from the very lamp posts that illuminated their grand home. The anger was a physical force pressing against the doors of the mansion. Inside the house, Delphine LaLaurie realized that her time had run out. The charm and social status that had protected her for so long offered no shield against a mob demanding blood. She and her husband managed to slip out of a side exit just as the crowd began to batter down the front doors. They climbed into a waiting carriage, and the driver whipped the horses into a frenzy. The carriage tore down Royal Street, with the mob in hot pursuit. Stones and bricks were thrown, shattering the windows of the vehicle. But the LaLauries managed to break through the crowd. They raced toward the waterfront, where a schooner was preparing to depart. It is believed they boarded the ship and fled to France, leaving their home and their victims behind. Back on Royal Street, the mob stormed the mansion. In their fury, they destroyed everything they could get their hands on. Furniture was smashed, and crystal chandeliers were pulled from the ceilings. They stripped the house bare, tearing the paper from the walls and digging up the courtyard. It was an exorcism of rage. As the people of New Orleans tried to destroy the physical memory of what had happened there, the victims found in the attic were taken to the local jail for public viewing, which was a common practice at the time to prove the crimes had occurred. Thousands of people filed past to witness the aftermath of the LaLaurie madness. The sight was so disturbing that it was reported in newspapers across the country. The victims were eventually taken to a hospital, but most of them died shortly after from the severity of their injuries. They had been kept alive only by the cruel will of their tormentor. And once free, their bodies finally gave out. For years after that night, the LaLaurie Mansion stood empty and ruined. It became a scar on the face of the French Quarter. The roof had collapsed in places, and the windows were gaping holes like empty eye sockets. No one wanted to buy the property, and even the homeless avoided seeking shelter within its walls. Stories began to circulate almost immediately about strange lights seen in the attic windows, and terrible sounds drifting from the ruin. The house had acquired a reputation that would define it for generations to come as the most haunted location in the city. Eventually, the house was restored and passed through many hands over the decades. It served as a music conservatory, a school for young women, and even an apartment building. But no matter who owned the deed or what the building was used for, the stories of paranormal activity persisted. Residents reported hearing the sound of footsteps pacing the floorboards above them when no one was there. Others claimed to hear the phantom smell of burning flesh and smoke that would appear and vanish without a source. The trauma of the past seemed to be etched into the very foundation. In the late 19th century, a man who lived in the house reported a terrifying encounter. He claimed that he was woken in the night by a heavy pressure on his chest. When he opened his eyes, he saw a black, misty figure hovering over him. He could feel waves of hatred radiating from the entity. He struggled to breathe as the figure leaned closer, and he heard a rasping female voice whisper something unintelligible in his ear. He fled the house the next morning and refused to return. This story is just one of hundreds that have been collected over the years. Another tenant found a hidden graveyard beneath the wooden floor of the interior courtyard during a renovation. The skeletons were twisted and intermingled, suggesting they had been dumped there in haste. The discovery confirmed the darkest rumors that the 7 victims found in the attic were not the only ones who had suffered at the hands of Delphine. The ground beneath the mansion was literally paved with the bones of the dead. The workers who found the remains refused to continue the job, citing an overwhelming feeling of dread that made them physically ill. Even in the modern era, the LaLaurie Mansion retains its dark power. It was briefly owned by the actor Nicolas Cage, who bought it hoping to write a horror novel within its walls. He famously did not stay there long and sold it shortly after. He spoke of the heavy atmosphere and the undeniable sense that he was not welcome. Today, the mansion is privately owned and closed to the public, but it remains a focal point for every ghost tour in the city. Crowds gather outside the gates every night to hear the tale and stare up at the dark windows. Tour guides tell stories of cameras malfunctioning only when pointed at the attic window. People standing on the sidewalk have reported feeling cold hands touching their necks or invisible fingers running through their hair. There are photographs taken by tourists that show strange anomalies and shadowy figures standing on the balconies. It seems that the energy of the LaLaurie torture chamber is still active, looping the horror of the past over and over again. The house acts as a beacon for sorrow and pain. Skeptics might say that the power of suggestion is responsible for these experiences. They argue that the story is so gruesome that the mind creates the ghosts it expects to see. But there is a consistency to the reports that defies simple explanation. Animals refuse to walk past the house, often bracing their legs and whining, until they are dragged to the other side of the street. Children who know nothing of the history often point to the upper windows and ask their parents about the lady watching them. These are primal reactions to a predator that is still present. The figure of Delphine LaLaurie herself is said to haunt the property. She has been seen moving through the courtyard, wearing a dark gown, with her face obscured by a veil. Witnesses describe a feeling of intense malice when she is near. It is as if her spirit is trapped in the place of her crimes, unable to move on, or perhaps unwilling to leave the seat of her power. She is the queen of this damnable kingdom, and she patrols her domain with the same arrogance she held in life. Her escape to Paris was only temporary, for her soul returned to the scene of her sins. The victims, too, are believed to remain. There are reports of a young girl seen running across the roof, vanishing over the edge, just as Lee did so many years ago. The sounds of chains rattling against wood are heard in the dead of night. These spirits are trapped in a cycle of trauma, reenacting their suffering for an audience of none. It is a tragedy that transcends death. The house is not just haunted, it is infected. The stone and timber have absorbed the agony of the people who died there, and now radiated back out into the world. Walking past the LaLaurie Mansion today, one is struck by how normal it looks at first glance. It is a stunning example of Royal Street architecture, with its gray facade and elegant design. But pause for a moment and let the crowd pass you by. Stand in the silence and look up at the third-floor attic window. There is a heaviness, there a density to the air that presses against your chest. It is the weight of history, the weight of secrets, and the weight of a darkness that time cannot wash away. The story of the LaLaurie Mansion is a reminder that monsters do not always look like monsters. They can be well-dressed socialites with charming smiles and polished manners. Evil can hide behind the most beautiful doors and drink from the finest crystal. The house stands as a monument to the capacity for human cruelty. It is a scar on the city that refuses to heal, a permanent warning that the veneer of civilization is thin and brittle. And for those who linger too long in its shadow, the mansion offers a chilling whisper that some nightmares never end. As you walk away from 1140 Royal Street, you might feel the urge to look back one last time. You might expect to see a curtain twitch or a shadow move, but the house usually keeps its secrets during the hours of the living. It waits for the silence of the deep night when the tourists are gone, and the fog rolls in from the river. That is when the house wakes up. That is when the chains begin to rattle, and the screams echo once more in the empty halls. The LaLaurie Mansion is not just a building. It is a memory of hell on earth.